Axel and I have taught seminars together many times. For the most part, we agree on Hegel, and he gets some things wrong about Marx. So I will try very hard to keep to his word and not correct, at the moment anyway, the things he says about Marx that are wrong. We can discuss that, I think, afterwards. Opinions about the relationship between Hegel and Marx have been subject to significant variation from the very beginning. Since the end of the 19th century, every era seems to have had its own idea about the relation between them. Right after Marx's death, during the early development of social democracy, the prevailing judgment was that there were few points of contact between the two thinkers. What was acknowledged was the important influence of Feuerbach on Marx's thinking, as well as the relevance of Kant. But the significance of Hegel's philosophy went unnoticed. Kan ni höra mig? Ska jag läsa långsammare? Det går så. This changed significantly when the discovery of the Paris manuscripts shed new light on the young Marx. This led scholars to pursue the traces of Hegel's thought in Marx's work, all the way to his mature critique of political economy. It was soon recognized that the structure of that critique was deeply informed by Hegel's dialectical method. After the Second World War, when interest in Marx's work was initially centered on themes like alienation and reification, other connections between their respective theories began to be drawn. A central issue was the influence on Marx of Hegel's idea of a necessary self-alienation of spirit into its other. These Hegelian Marxist interpretations were decisively opposed in the 1960s by Althusser, who launched the thesis that there was an epistemological break between Marx's early writings and his later ones, marking a complete emancipation of his mature economic works from the influence of Hegel. Today, the prevailing view is again the opposite. One might even say that the two thinkers are now more closely associated than ever before. Not only is Hegel's work regarded as a source of philosophical inspiration for Marx, as it was in Lukács's time, but it is also recognized as a treasure trove of insights in social theory, which can be used to supplement and improve on Marx's doctrines. Is this okay? I hear a little bit. Is it come across okay? Yeah.
Perfectly fine.
Okay, because I can hear it twice. This new evaluation of the relationship between Hegel and Marx was prompted by a number of interpretive shifts over the course of the past several decades. For instance, Charles Taylor's path-breaking studies made it seem much more natural to us to view Hegel not simply as a system builder seeking to comprehend the world in its totality, but also as an empirically informed social theorist. His philosophy of right is viewed today as an attempt to diagnose the dynamics and crises of modern societies, containing the seeds of a sociological analysis that anticipated central insights of this not yet existing discipline. Further scholarship has made it clear how Hegel's notion of objective spirit conceptualizes the integration of societies as the result of acts of mutual recognition. This too has brought the sociological dimension of his theory into much sharper focus compared to past readings. At the same time, the interpretation of Marx's theory has been subject to similar shifts. Max Weber and Josef Schumpeter have already taken the sober approach of viewing his work simply as a competitor to their own efforts at explaining capitalist societies. This trend has continued since and has even increased as actual circumstances have presented less reason to think of Marx's theory as a revolutionary replacement of philosophy as such, and an alternative to merely explanatory approaches to understanding modernity. By now, we've become accustomed to detaching Marx's diagnosis of capitalism from its political and practical context, and to treat it as what it always was, at least in part, an attempt to theorize the dynamics and crises of modern societies. As a consequence of these various interpretive shifts, we no longer assume that the relationship between the two authors is marked by any sharp break or discontinuity. Instead, we view them as offering competing analyses of modern society so that it makes sense to ask what one might have learned from the other. My aim today is to compare the theories of these two authors from this perspective. My starting point will be the assumptions about the philosophy of history that served as the basis of both Hegel's and Marx's diagnoses of modern society. In a second step, I will then turn to the advantages of Hegel's social theory vis-à-vis that of Marx. My third step consists in reversing this perspective and considering the merits of Marx's analysis of capitalism. This will finally bring me to the question, under what conditions and in what way the two approaches might fruitfully complement each other. Looking back to the works of Marx and Hegel from a contemporary perspective, one soon notices that their social analyses rely to a surprising degree on shared premises concerning the philosophy of history. It's these theoretical commonalities which today allow us to treat the two thinkers from a comparative perspective. To be sure, many other 19th century social theorists shared Hegel's and Marx's aim of uncovering the moving forces and dynamic laws of modern society. Saint-Simon and Tocqueville in France and John Stuart Mill in England can stand in for an entire spectrum of views. But even abstracting from the differences between these three authors, Hegel and Marx are further set apart from them by the fact that both relied on a philosophy of history in order to grasp the social challenges of their time. Despite the differences between them, they share the peculiar assumption that modern society is the most recent stage of a developmental process in which reason manifests itself in the external world. It's a familiar fact that Hegel's interpretation of modern society rests on a philosophy of history that postulates a process in which spirit realizes itself. He faults both Kant and Fichte for failing to properly understand the nature of reason. While both acknowledge that reason is the basis of all reality, they fail to see that reason is not simply a human faculty, but rather an all-comprehending entity that gradually unfolds over time until it has fully realized its own potential. This ontological assumption allows Hegel to interpret the whole of human history as one particular stage in the process of spirit's self-realization. After first realizing itself in nature through its own spontaneous activity, spirit then returns into itself and gradually lets the social world be shaped by its determinations, amounting to what Hegel calls a progress in the consciousness of freedom. Today, this framework, which postulates a teleology of increasing freedom underlying all human history, appears quite alien to us. Yet without it, Hegel's interpretation of modern society is not properly intelligible. To him, modern institutions and practices are above all embodiments of the most advanced stage within the world historical process of an increasing consciousness of freedom, a stage marked by the realization of all the preconditions for a truly self-determined life on the part of each individual. Modern society, which Hegel views as the outcome of a conflict-ridden developmental process, is for him an institutional realization of freedom. Even though Marx doesn't subscribe to the result of Hegel's philosophy of history, he derives it from an essential element of his own interpretation of the specific structure of modern society. Born almost half a century later than Hegel, Marx is no longer a philosophical idealist, willing to countenance the thought that all of reality is the realization of a self-determining spirit. At the beginning of his intellectual development, he was profoundly influenced by Feuerbach's naturalism, and the idea that all that exists is a product of reason's unfolding was entirely remote to him. For Marx, we as human beings are first of all surrounded by nature, and we must relate to nature in productive ways in order to maintain ourselves. We are capable of doing this because we have the ability to use tools, which sets us apart from all other living beings. Where Marx is at his best, he conceives of the special status of human beings as consisting in a capacity to cooperate with each other by mutually relating to each other's intentions, and thus establishing an entirely new, irreducibly social class of mental operations. Supplemented by recent empirical findings, this basic idea points the way to theories such as Michael Tomasello's who claims that it was the establishment of cooperative labor which enabled humans to develop basic forms of morality and multi-perspectival thinking. Despite this distance between Marx and Hegel, Marx's account of the process by which humans modify nature through their labor, based on their capacity for cooperation, closely mirrors Hegel's account of the self-development of spirit. Marx argues that once we have learned to use tools cooperatively by mutually taking up each other's perspectives, nature comes to be gradually shaped by us and comes to reflect our own rational determinations, resulting in an expansion of the realm of our freedom. What Marx says here about the essential spiritual powers of man, meaning our species' capacity for cooperation, is structurally similar to the features of spirit as characterized by Hegel. While reason means two different things to them, a human capacity for Marx, a property of an all-encompassing spirit for Hegel, both think of reason as something that comes to be fully developed only by realizing itself in something external to it. The difference between the two thinkers is that Marx's naturalistic assumptions lead him to date the beginning of the process of reason's self-unfolding to a point that in Hegel's view is already the result of reason's realization in nature itself. But like Marx, Hegel views the history of human society as a process in which natural constraints are gradually diminished through the work of spiritual energy, with a corresponding increase of freedom in our social practices. These parallels show that Marx always remained Hegel's disciple regarding the central assumption that the development of society over time constitutes progress in the consciousness of freedom. Enabled by practices of cooperation, we give ourselves reality to our own spirit, we give objective reality to our own spirit by laboring on the natural world surrounding us. And in so doing, we come to be at home in that world in a way that opens up ever-increasing opportunities for shaping social norms and institutions. Marx's adoption of Hegel's central assumptions regarding the philosophy of history explains why he too is forced to describe modern society as the most advanced stage in the historical evolution of social structures. Numerous passages in Marx's work show that he conceives of human history up to the present as a process of overcoming natural constraints and fetters, which comes to a preliminary conclusion in the comparatively free practices of contemporary bourgeois society. Yet there are some differences between Marx's and Hegel's respective assessments of the balance of gains and losses as far as the freedom of modern societies is concerned. These differences are an indication that they do, after all, have somewhat different conceptions of the history of civilization, understood as a process of the self-alienation of spirit. While Marx thinks of this process as consisting first and foremost in mankind's increasing domination over nature, as an emancipation from the constraints of both external and internal nature, Hegel's conception gives greater weight to the progressive transformation of the ways in which human beings relate to each other. For Hegel, the overcoming of natural limitations always has an impact on socially practiced moral norms, whereas Marx identifies such an overcoming more narrowly with an expansion of human productive forces, conceived broadly as encompassing the means to control both our environment and our own motivational potential. This fundamental difference shows that despite their shared commitment to the self-alienation model of spirit, Hegel and Marx take quite divergent views regarding the substance and character of the process of alienation itself. With regard to both the content of reason and the mechanism through which reason is realized, there is so little consensus between them that they inevitably arrive at different assessments of the accomplishments of modern societies. I'll now take a closer look at the differences between Hegel and Marx regarding the character of historical progress, and then turn to the consequences these differences have for their respective diagnoses of modern societies. This is part 2. Both Hegel and Marx seem to proceed on the assumption that human history is a process in which our freedom is gradually realized. In Hegel's view, this is so because spirit, having realized itself in nature and then returned into itself, seeks to embody in the world of social institutions its own determinations, which consists in its self-realization, free from external constraints. Spirit must therefore manifest itself in human history and society in such a way that it gradually produces the institutional preconditions required for a free communal life of all the members of a society. As we've seen, what remains of this idealist conception in Marx is the thought that spirit or reason can realize itself only by alienating itself into something external to it. But in line with his naturalist assumptions, Marx's version of this thought focuses on the processes of man's engagement with nature. This gives rise to his lifelong commitment to the idea that we as humans are capable of making our freedom a historical reality, just to the extent to which we rely on our cooperative potential to turn nature into a reflection of our rational aims, and thereby into a place that will accommodate those aims. Whatever differences we may discover between Hegel and Marx will, in my view, be a consequence of the fact that they locate the social realization of reason in different spheres. Hegel locates this process in the relationship between spirit and our social institutions, since spirit has antecedently exerted itself on the natural world. Marx, by contrast, locates this process in the relationship between human reason and our natural surroundings, since he's unable to countenance a prior spiritualization of nature unmediated by social practices. This divergence can also be expressed as follows. Marx describes social progress in terms of a developmental pattern that Hegel introduced to capture the prior process of spirit's realization in nature. The result of this skewed adaptation of the Hegelian schema is perhaps best described as a neglect of the ways in which the activity of reason shapes the normative order of our institutionally regulated social life. Even though his theoretical starting point, human cooperation, would have allowed Marx to attend to the phylogenetic sources of social norms, his reconstruction of our species' history remains limited to the ways in which our rational capacities lead to an expansion of our dominance over nature. The realization of reason thus comes to be wholly identified by him with our increased freedom vis-à-vis the natural world. The corresponding neglect of the ways in which freedom is increased in the sphere of social interaction entails a number of disadvantages of Marx's theory as compared to the implications that Hegel's philosophy has for social theory. To begin, Hegel's concept of society allows him to consider a much broader spectrum of institutional forms than can Marx, given the latter's more limited focus on the manipulation of nature. It's clear that when Hegel seeks to comprehend society as objective spirit, this must include for him all those social forms in which human beings learn to satisfy their natural needs. Spirit can obtain objectivity and come to be at home within a social formation only to the extent that it gives rise to the institutions that allow human beings to reproduce across generations. When Hegel speaks of societies, he therefore has in mind a totality of social practices that are calibrated with each other by way of cultural and normative commonalities, but which also, and importantly, must be capable of satisfying our most basic needs. Setting aside Hegel's idealist assumptions, the concept of objective spirit anticipates in a surprising way the basic insight of classical sociology. That is, the observation that societies are normatively integrated units in which a variety of stable, institutional, and interconnected practices serve a range of functions essential to social reproduction. By contrast, Marx's narrower function on humanity's relation to nature leads him to adopt a more restricted conception of society. The unfortunate term, relations of production, often used by him synonymously with society, creates the impression that all of a society's institutions are ultimately aimed at the productive appropriation of nature. But neither political rule nor familial reproduction, to name just two, can be adequately understood in their normative structure by reference to economic purposes alone. The drawbacks of Marx's terminological choices compared to Hegel's become more apparent when we consider the studies of Karl Polanyi, which show that only few pre-capitalist societies knew anything like a distinctive and separate sphere of economic reproduction. As we can learn from Polanyi and other economic historians, economic relations of labor and exchange used to be so thoroughly embedded into other social functions that they were neither experienced as self-standing activities nor normatively regulated as such. It is then quite misleading to follow Marx in conceiving of all societies as relations of production, as institutional manifestations of various particular forms of mastery over nature. Hegel's approach is much more persuasive here. The concept of objective spirit merely captures the fact that the various spheres of social activity, including those devoted to the performance of vital functions, are, in the first place, manifestations of general norms and thus of something spiritual, whereas the specific content of those norms and the relations between the various functional spheres depend on the progress of human history. The idealist surplus of this conception, which consists in the idea that such norms are themselves the product of a self-determining entity called spirit, can be removed without too much difficulty given more recent philosophical developments. We can follow John Searle and other social theorists in thinking of the spiritual generation of norms as a cognitive activity performed by mutually cooperating subjects. What is then left of idealism is just the claim that societies depend on a certain intersubjective consensus among their members concerning the normative regulation of each of the various functional spheres. Things are no different regarding a further point of comparison between Hegel and Marx, namely, the question of how to think about the social mechanism by which the progressive realization of freedom is brought about over the course of human history. Here too, the German idealist seems to be better positioned than his materialist successor. As we've seen, both proceed from the assumption that this process should be regarded as a consequence of the gradual externalization of spiritual processes, that is, the interaction of spirit with something other than itself. In Hegel's theory, for systematic reasons, this other encompasses all the institutions required for the reproduction of society. For Marx, on the other hand, spirit's other is external and internal nature, both of which we can gradually master thanks to our cooperative abilities, and in which we can in this way come to be at home. If we now ask how each of the two philosophers proposes to explain the dynamic driving this process of reason's self-realization, we see that Hegel's explanatory strategy has some advantages. Even though he thinks of the realization of reason as a process affected by reason itself, and in that sense as an automatic development, he too needs to offer at least a broadly plausible account of how this kind of progress in history can be understood as a worldly occurrence. Here, he relies on the idea that a historical form of life comes to an end when it no longer offers sufficient normative space for the realization of those claims on the part of individuals that have been able to arise on the basis of this form of life itself. Thus, for Hegel, each social formation contains the seeds of its own transformation, since it inevitably leads some groups of people to develop moral hopes and expectations that cannot be properly realized within the established institutional framework. It's true that this moral explanation is sociologically unsatisfactory, since it leaves us largely in the dark about the way in which these structurally unsatisfiable claims are supposed to arise in the context of social conflicts. Only in a few places does Hegel let on that he conceives of this kind of conflict as a struggle for recognition, in which desires for the social realization of new and previously unknown freedoms clash with an established social order that imminently gives rise to these very desires. But this brief sketch suffices to show how fertile is Hegel's endeavor to find an everyday social complement to the self-propelled process of spirit's self-realization in objective institutions. Enriched by sociological hypotheses, Hegel's basic approach can be developed into the fruitful idea that what drives the historical process of freedom's realization is the occurrence of struggles for the social inclusion of previously excluded groups. By comparison, Marx's account of the social mechanism said to be responsible for the gradual extension of our freedom looks much less convincing. As many have observed, his explanatory proposals generally rely on a technological determinism that tends to obscure rather than illuminate the connection, he asserts, between an increased mastery over nature and an increase in freedom. The point of departure for this explanatory model is again the thesis that our capacity for cooperation enables us increasingly to appropriate both external and internal nature. But when it comes to explaining the driving force of progress in the realization of freedom, Marx attends only to the latter dimension, our relation to the natural world around us. Marx's term for the extent of our dominion over this aspect of nature at any given time is productive force, which refers to the totality of technological means and methods a society has at its disposal to exploit existing natural resources. In a second step, Marx thinks that our ability to constantly improve and increase our capacity for cooperation entails a historical process whereby a society's productive forces are constantly increased. He believes that the further history progresses, the greater becomes society's technical capacity for the productive appropriation of the natural world. The decisive step in Marx's explanation is the third one. He asserts that the institutional structures of all societies, which Marx subsumes under the term relations of production, are characterized by a certain inertia and rigidity, so that any boost in productive forces brings with it a lagging adjustment of those institutional structures to the new technologies and modes of production. The essence of Marx's explanation is thus that endogenous progress in the technological capacities for manipulating the natural world regularly brings in its wake a normative improvement in the modes of social interaction. What remains especially unclear about this model is why we should believe that the development of productive forces will make each stage lead institutionalized social orders to realize a greater degree of freedom. While it may be true that technological advances increase our elbow room vis-à-vis natural constraints, it's quite dubious to infer from this an automatic increase in social freedom. Often the contrary will be the case, and improved technologies will endanger the continued existence of previously attained liberties. Marx's proposed explanation of the gradual realization of freedom is far too optimistic regarding the normative potential in the development of the productive forces. Unlike Hegel, he believes that technological progress, as such, is capable of liberating institutionalized social orders from social domination and inherited dependence. As though he himself had a sense of this weakness, Marx supplemented his first explanatory approach by a second one, developed at least in broad outline. On this second proposal, the moving force behind the social realization of freedom isn't simply the growth of our technological abilities, but rather the struggles of oppressed classes for the realization of their needs and interests. It becomes apparent in the Communist Manifesto that this alternative model is not entirely independent of the first one, since Marx ties the interests of the various classes struggling for dominance to the opportunities for influence afforded by a given stage in the development of productive forces. Just as the bourgeoisie is said to have begun fighting for social domination at the very moment in history when its increased control over the means of production allowed it to do so, the proletariat too will be in a position to come to power once the new factory system has created the necessary economic preconditions. It's easily seen that this second explanation of social progress, which focuses on the transformative power of class struggle, still fails to accord an independent role to the historically changing ensemble of social practices. Instead, Marx claims that progress in the realization of freedom ultimately results from a series of struggles of oppressed groups fighting for social dominance of their respective economic interests, as though we were entitled to assume that all pre-modern societies had already established and been centered around something like a distinctive sphere of economic production. Thus, Marx's second explanatory proposal, too, does not measure up to Hegel's approach of postulating a social equivalent to the self-realization of spirit in social institutions. Instead of leaving it open exactly what kind of social inclusion and recognition are at issue in any given social group's struggle, Marx simply assumes the primacy of economic interests in a way unsupported by the historical evidence. This reinforces the earlier observation that Marx was unwise to reduce the large range of forms of social organization to the category of the relations of production. A third drawback of Marx's economic reductionism comes into focus when we compare his analysis of the achievements of modern societies with Hegel's. As we saw earlier, both thinkers proceed on the assumption that the modern social order is the most advanced stage of the world historical process of reasoned self-realization, since the modern set of social institutions has considerably extended the space of individual liberties. Like Hegel, Marx holds that the overcoming of feudal social orders amounted to a liberation from the fetters of inherited dependencies and forms of subjection, so that persons now enjoy much more extensive opportunities for individual self-determination. But when it comes to the further theoretical task of offering a more detailed account of those newly created liberties, we find substantial differences between the two thinkers, which I already briefly mentioned at the outset. Hegel's view was that the rationality of the modern social order consists in the fact that it offers its members a whole spectrum of social roles that will allow them to realize their individuality under conditions of mutual recognition, and thus freely. For Hegel, this includes all the central institutions of the new social order: the family, the market, and the state. Taken together, these three spheres of activity were regarded by Hegel as amounting to a modern form of ethical life, a term he employed to indicate that individual freedom is realized in the shared exercise of established practices rather than in private acts of choice. Yet, despite asserting the primacy of communicative freedom over personal or private freedom, Hegel never went so far as to doubt the normative significance of modern structures of right. On the contrary, throughout his work, he continued to regard the then only recently established principle of free and equal liberties as a central achievement of modern societies, since these liberties require the state to protect each individual's opportunity to check and consolidate his or her ethical decisions without the intervention of others. This is an issue in which Marx is unsure how to position himself. For one, Marx harbors substantial doubts concerning Hegel's entire doctrine of ethical life, since he suspects it of glossing over the defects of actually existing social institutions. I'll have more to say on this later. But in addition to this, Marx doubts that modern liberal rights should really be accorded the normative significance that his predecessor attributed to them. If we recall how Marx pictures the historical process whereby freedom is realized, we're led to a quite different assessment of the achievements of modern societies. What's distinctive of this new social structure is an extension of freedom, not in the interpersonal domain, but rather with respect to the relation between the human species and its natural environment. Marx believes that the liberties gained in this way, which are embodied in vastly increased productive capacities, are not yet adequately reflected in the capitalist relations of production. Our increased ability to control natural processes and to harness them for our own purposes calls for a different type of social freedom than the one established within the present institutional order. As Marx sees it, owing to social inertia, these present arrangements reflect a purely private and egoistical conception of freedom. The massively improved technologies and methods of production create the possibility, and indeed the historical need, to replace this narrow market-based conception of freedom by a broader cooperative conception. In the present day, the only social relations of production adequate to the state of modern productive forces would be ones that subject the organization of labor and the distribution of goods to the shared will of freely cooperating producers. But however engaging this socialist vision may be, it leads Marx to completely overlook the democratic potential of modern liberal rights. The protection of individual self-determination afforded by such rights appeared to him to be too focused on private interests and therefore to be of a piece with the competitive economic system of capitalism. Hence, he regarded them not as normative achievements of a new social order, but as remnants of a declining one. On this point, too, then, Hegel's strengths outweigh Marx's. It's true that Hegel, like Marx, has deep reservations about the liberal tendency to equate individual freedom with the liberty to pursue one's own private interests without restraint. Like his materialist successor, Hegel doesn't yet recognize the enormous contribution these liberal rights were to make in advancing democratic political decision-making on the part of equal citizens. Nevertheless, Hegel viewed the novel principle of according all members of a society an equal right to individual self-determination as an irreversible achievement of modern societies. Unlike Marx, he was convinced that any other more communicative or ethical form of freedom would continue to require, as its normative basis, a protected right on the part of individuals to develop and pursue their own particular aims. I need to pause now before going to part 3. This is difficult. Okay, we've just heard many ways how Hegel is superior to Marx. And now we're going to hear what Marx has to offer Hegel. What I've been saying so far might make it appear as though Hegel's social theory was in every respect superior to the historical materialism of his disciple. With regard both to an adequately complex conception of society, to the identification of the moving force behind the realization of freedom, and to the diagnosis of the normative achievements of modernity, Hegel offers explanations that are better, or at any rate more fruitful for our purposes today. Yet this initial comparison is misleading to the extent that it's exclusively focused on the conceptual resources for social theory, supplemented by a philosophy of history. Once we direct our attention away from these foundational issues and towards the empirical content of the two theories, things begin to look somewhat different, and the advantages of Marx's social analysis come to light. In this final section of my talk, I'll present this other side of the balance sheet in broad outline. In doing so, it's important to bear in mind that Marx had the benefit of an additional 50 years' time to observe the actual development of modern societies. Whereas Hegel devised his social theory at the outset of capitalist industrialization, Marx was writing at the apex of that development, placing him in an advantageous epistemic position, which inevitably turned out to be fruitful for his diagnosis of capitalism. As we've seen, Hegel assumed that the world historical process of a progress in the consciousness of freedom had reached at least a preliminary conclusion in the social structure of modern ethical life. He took himself to be entitled to this judgment because, in his view, the three spheres of modern society, the family based on reciprocal affection, the capitalist market, and the modern constitutional state, provided the institutional preconditions that would allow the members of this society to realize their particularity through free cooperation with others, based on the legal protection of their individual freedom of choice. It's just this image of modern society that Marx is unwilling and unable to accept. Based on his research on political economy, he assumes against Hegel that the second element of this tripartite structure, the capitalist market, contains destructive forces that undermine both the freedom of the individual and the normative autonomy of the two other spheres. To be sure, Hegel too had been skeptical of the market system. In his philosophy of right, he recommended that the threat of market excesses be held in check by regulative and cooperative institutions. But the Marxian notion that the existence of a sphere that allows for the free exchange of economic goods and services might undermine the entire web of ethical practice remained alien to Hegel. Yet this was just what Marx's critique of political economy was intended to demonstrate, and his efforts yielded a number of insights with which we can substantially enrich Hegel's social theory. In this context, all the comparative disadvantages of Marx's theory discussed so far paradoxically work in his favor. The conceptual reduction of society to a set of relations of production allows him to focus exclusively on the economic sphere and to study it in abstraction from political or institutional influences. Here, Marx attends to several important phenomena that have been only dimly foreseen in Hegel's philosophy of right. Thus, he argues that the employment contract, the wage-labor contract is what Axel means here, one of the normative foundations of the new economic order, does not fulfill its promise of realizing individual freedom of choice, since those who depend on wages are forced to agree to the contract's terms, given their lack of alternative options. Moreover, according to Marx, their productive labor generates a surplus value for which they're not compensated, so that they're subject to structural exploitation. The entrepreneur reaping the resulting profits is for his part continually forced to reinvest his gains with the aim of generating further profit, requiring him to tap ever new markets for his products. This gives the capitalist market an expansionary dynamic, leading to a gradual subjection of all areas of life under the principle of marketability, resulting also in a further expansion of the capitalist power, to the point where government turns into class domination and the rule of law leads to class justice. These four elements of Marx's analysis of capitalism are complemented by an explanation of why it's so difficult for those involved in this economic system to understand its harmful mechanisms. The explanation, in his view, lies in the existence of legitimizing, concealing, and obfuscating interpretations that he calls ideologies. One of his aims is to show that practices of economic exchange necessarily give rise to such ideologies. Not all of these basic assumptions of Marx's analysis of capitalism have survived critical scrutiny. Some claims have needed refinement in the light of objections from economists and other social scientists, and some claims have had to be abandoned altogether. For instance, there's probably no one today who still subscribes to Marx's labor theory of value, which forms the background of his thesis about the structural exploitation of wage laborers. Similarly contested are his assumptions concerning the cognitive effects of ideologies said to emerge in some way from the economic practices themselves. But these two central elements of Marx's analysis of capitalism, his thesis about the unfreedom of wage laborers and his thesis about the expansionary dynamic inherent in the market, have turned out to be resilient in the face of later developments and hardly open to doubt. Especially after witnessing the so-called neoliberal breakdown of economic barriers over the past several decades, we can safely assume that there's a pressure inherent in our economic system that tends to undermine individual freedom of choice, both for wage laborers and in other areas of life. But this observation should prompt us to turn to Hegel's social theory once again. We've seen that despite its philosophical merits, its engagement with contemporary society didn't take sufficient account of the perilous dynamic of capitalist economic systems. The question now is therefore how the aspects of capitalism identified by Marx might be incorporated into the framework of Hegel's social theory without destroying its inner architectonic. In conclusion, I'd like to offer some conjectures about how this might be done. Every attempt to reconcile the two theories in the way I just hinted at, that is, by retaining a mitigated version of the German idealist social theory and supplementing it with the results of his materialist disciples' analysis of capitalism, faces a number of obstacles. The greatest challenge is the fact that Marx presented his analysis of capitalism in a way that seems to shield it from any attempt at adapting it for other purposes. The internal structure and the expansive dynamic of the modern economic system are depicted under the influence of Hegel as though they were being caused by the automatic activity of capital, forming a closed cycle immune to external influences. Whichever interpretation of this methodology one chooses, whether one regards it as modeled on Hegel's logic or on his phenomenology, it's not straightforwardly compatible with Hegel's sketch of a social theory. For Hegel, after all, social structures are shaped most basically not by capital, but rather by an objective spirit, consisting of shared social norms. In order to integrate the results of Marx's analysis of capitalism into the framework of Hegel's social theory, we need first to break through Marx's mode of presentation. We must abandon the idea that capital, like Hegel's spirit, proceeds autonomously and pervades all areas of society with its inner dynamic. Instead, we should adopt a much more open conception of the capitalist economic sphere, which gives due place to the influence of changing social norms. Only through such a reorientation of political economy can we do justice to the historical fact that the opportunity to pursue the profit principle varies with institutional and cultural circumstances, being much greater today, for instance, than 40 or 50 years ago. A consequence of this first modification is that the capitalist economy comes to be seen as partly dependent on the content of the institutional rules that Hegel called objective spirit. A second modification that's needed in order to fuse Marx's analysis of capitalism with a social theory inspired by Hegel concerns not its explanatory content, but its sociological framing. We've already seen that Marx's notion of relations of production depicts all social spheres as directly or indirectly concerned with the goal of mastery over nature. In the context of his analysis of capitalism, this gives rise to the problem that he lacks the conceptual resources to identify just which norms are being violated when the dynamic capitalist principle of marketization comes to permeate other spheres of social life. Another way of describing this deficit would be by saying that Marx lacks an understanding of the functional complexity of societies, which requires that different spheres of activity be subject to different sets of norms that allow those activities to fulfill their specific functions. He's therefore unable to explain why we should find it in any way dangerous or problematic when the capitalist principles of profitability and marketization come to inform and to dominate other areas of social reproduction. Thus, on this point too, Marx's analysis of capitalism needs certain revisions if it's to become a fruitful part of Hegelian social theory. What's needed is an awareness that within modern societies, the capitalist market is only one sphere of social activity among others, and that each of these spheres serves particular functions which require that its activities be governed by their own norms. What I've just said indicates that Hegel's social theory doesn't meet all the requirements it would need to fulfill in order to fruitfully accommodate the important insights of Marx's analysis of capitalism. If Marx lacks an understanding of the functional complexity of modern societies, Hegel fails to recognize that there can be deep normative tensions between the various functionally specialized social spheres. Hegel's doctrine of ethical life admits the possibility that failures on the part of the state or deficits of rationality on the part of its members may cause the norms governing any particular sphere to dry up, as it were. But he doesn't allow for the possibility that one of these different sets of norms might intrude into other social spheres and undermine or incapacitate the norms proper to them. We could say that Hegel took the process of social differentiation to be an irreversible given, something that could not possibly be changed by future developments. Whatever other internal threats a modern, rationally ordered society might face, the functional separation between the family, the market, and the state is taken for granted as a permanent feature of this new social order. Yet this assumption deprives Hegel's theory of the conceptual means to analyze the kinds of processes that Marx described as real subsumption. Hegel never allowed for the possibility that the capitalist mindset might come to intrude into non-economic spheres of life. In this respect, then, his theory stands in need of fundamental revision. The functional differentiation of modern societies shouldn't be regarded as a permanent empirical given, but merely as a normative goal, which may be more or less fully realized in a society's institutions, depending on the social struggles present at that moment. This isn't the only element of Hegel's social theory that needs to be revised. A further revision concerns Hegel's reliance on the idea that the notion of contract supplies the economic system of the market with a legal foundation that ensures its general rationality and legitimacy, since the obligations of contracting parties are voluntarily undertaken. What's wrong with this picture isn't the idea that contract is a legitimate basis of the new economic order, in that it grants each individual the freedom to determine how to employ his or her resources and services, in contrast with previous economic systems resting on personal ties and dependencies. This normative virtue of contract-based economic orders is one that Adam Smith articulated quite clearly, so that Hegel was able to simply follow him on this point. The problematic aspect of Hegel's view lies rather in the fact that he simply transposes the features of contracts between commercial parties onto the relationship between capitalists and wage laborers. His naive disregard for the influence of duress and coercion testifies to his more general tendency to neglect the phenomena of power and domination. Hegel's doctrine of ethical life seems to be completely unaware of the possibility that individuals' consent to existing ethical obligations may be owed not to rational considerations, but instead to a lack of alternatives, to threats of force, or to subtle persuasion. Yet these are just the kinds of factors that Marx aimed to place at the center of his account of capitalism when he depicted the apparent voluntariness of the employment contract as a mere illusion, given that those dependent on wages have no choice but to consent or face indigence. Hegel's faith that the ethical structure of modern societies had given institutional reality to the idea of freedom led him to completely overlook the kinds of social mechanisms that continue even today to contribute to the coercion and oppression of particular groups. He went astray in dating the conclusion of the historical struggle for inclusion and recognition to the beginning of modernity, and in depicting social relations after this point only in the optimistic terms of voluntary cooperation. Correcting this serious deficit of Hegel's social theory would require more than simply supplementing its model of modern ethical life with the notions of force and coercion. What it would require, rather, is that we use Hegel's own categories to demonstrate for each of the social spheres what mechanisms inherent to it enable some subset of its participants to dominate others. Only when this has been accomplished, only once it has been shown that the different institutional forms of mutual recognition can give rise to specific kinds of exclusion and coercion, can the results of Marx's analysis of capitalism be properly incorporated into Hegel's social theory. For only then can the deprivations of freedom generated by the market and targeted by Marx's critique of political economy be integrated into a more comprehensive picture of modern societies, one that extends to other forms of oppression as well. The various revisions I've outlined still take us only halfway towards the goal of establishing a cross-fertilizing relationship between Hegel and Marx. So far, I haven't mentioned what's surely the greatest challenge facing such a conciliation of views, namely, to revise Hegel's concept of spirit in such a way that it would come to be at least somewhat closer to Marx's theoretical starting point, that is, the cooperation among socially embedded individuals. My call for revisions on both sides notwithstanding, the question remains how one might go about reconciling materialism and idealism, the image of man placed in nature, and the appeal to a self-determining spirit. But for the purposes of today's talk, I hope to have shown that Marx's analysis of capitalism could only benefit from being embedded in a social theory derived from Hegel. The valuable insights contained in the younger philosopher's theory can be better articulated when they're transposed into the framework developed by his older predecessor. Thank you.